The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield as Captain Sarah Mitchell stood before the towering Apache helicopter. Her flight suit hung perfectly pressed, her boots polished to a mirror shine, but none of that mattered to the men gathered in small groups nearby. Their whispers carried across the tarmac like poison on the wind. A woman flying an Apache, in combat? The very idea seemed absurd to them. Sarah had heard it all before. Every step of her military career had been marked by doubt and dismissal. From basic training to flight school, she had faced instructors who gave her the hardest tasks, hoping she would quit. She had endured classmates who refused to study with her, certain she would wash out anyway. Even now, after earning her wings and qualifying on the most advanced attack helicopter in the arsenal, the skepticism followed her like a shadow. The Apache AH-64 was not just any aircraft. It was a beast of war, weighing over 10,000 pounds and bristling with weapons that could turn the tide of battle. The helicopter required immense physical strength to control, especially in combat situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The conventional wisdom said women lacked the upper body strength, and the killer instinct needed to master such a machine. Sarah knew this belief ran deep in the military culture, passed down through generations of warriors who had never seen a woman prove otherwise. Her commanding officer, Colonel James Bradford, had made his position painfully clear during her assignment briefing. He sat behind his desk, his face carved from stone as he explained that she would be placed in a support role. No direct combat missions, no high-risk operations, just transportation and reconnaissance, he said, as if those tasks were somehow more suitable for her gender. The words stung not because they were harsh, but because they revealed the depth of his doubt in her abilities. But Sarah had not come this far to fly safe missions from the sidelines. Her father had been an Army pilot who died in service when she was 12 years old. She remembered sitting in his lap as a child, her small hands gripping the toy helicopter controls he had built for her. He used to tell her stories about flying, about the freedom and responsibility that came with taking a machine into the sky. When he died, something crystallized inside her. She would follow his path no matter how many obstacles stood in her way. Flight school had been brutal. The physical demands pushed her body to its limits every single day. While her male counterparts relied on raw strength, Sarah learned to use technique and precision. She studied the mechanics of flight until she could visualize every hydraulic line and every rotor movement. She practiced emergency procedures until her responses became pure muscle memory. When others slept, she ran the simulators, programming in the most challenging scenarios she could imagine. The Apache became her obsession. She learned that the helicopter was not just about brute force, but about finesse and understanding. The aircraft responded to a pilot who knew its personality, who could feel its movements through their body and anticipate its needs. Sarah spent hours studying gun camera footage from combat veterans, analyzing their techniques and decisions. She read every after-action report she could access, building a mental library of tactics and situations. Her breakthrough came during an advanced training exercise in the Nevada desert. The scenario involved multiple targets, simulated enemy fire, and challenging terrain. Many of her classmates struggled with the complexity, their approaches too aggressive or too cautious. Sarah flew differently. She used the terrain to mask her approach, came in low and fast, and engaged each target with surgical precision. Her weapons accuracy scores were the highest in her class. Her fuel efficiency was remarkable. Most importantly, her decision-making under pressure impressed even the most skeptical instructors. Yet here she stood, months after that triumph, still fighting to be taken seriously. The deployment orders had come through 3 weeks ago. Her unit was heading to a conflict zone where Apache helicopters would play a crucial role in supporting ground forces. Everyone assumed Sarah would remain at the rear base, perhaps flying supply runs or medical evacuations. The assumptions infuriated her, but she kept her emotions locked away, knowing that any display of frustration would only confirm their biases. The other pilots in her unit treated her with polite distance. They were not openly hostile, but neither did they include her in their briefings or their informal strategy sessions. She was an outsider, tolerated but not trusted. They would grab coffee together and discuss tactics, their voices falling silent when she approached. They would review mission footage in small groups, but somehow never thought to invite her. The isolation was sometimes harder to bear than the open skepticism. Master Sergeant Tony Rodriguez was different. The veteran crew chief had worked on Apaches for 15 years and had flown with dozens of pilots. He judged them not by their gender or their background, but by how they treated their aircraft and their crew. When Sarah first arrived at the unit, she had spent hours talking with him about the helicopter systems, asking questions that revealed her deep technical knowledge. Rodriguez appreciated that. He had seen too many hotshot pilots who thought they knew everything, only to make basic mistakes that endangered everyone. One evening, as Sarah performed her pre-flight inspection with meticulous care, Rodriguez approached her. His weathered face carried the experience of countless missions, and his eyes held a shrewd intelligence that missed nothing. He watched her check the rotor heads, examining each bolt and connection with careful attention. He saw how she ran her hands along the weapon systems, not just looking but feeling for anything out of place. When she finished, he nodded slowly. The approval in that simple gesture meant more to Sarah than a dozen commendations. Rodriguez told her that in all his years, he had rarely seen a pilot with such attention to detail. He said that flying was not about strength or gender, but about respect for the machine and dedication to the mission. His words gave her a foundation of support in an environment that offered little encouragement. From that day forward, Rodriguez made it clear to anyone who would listen that Captain Mitchell was a pilot he would fly with any day. The night before the unit's deployment, Sarah sat alone in her quarters staring at a photograph of her father in his flight suit. She thought about all the barriers she had overcome and all those that still remained. Tomorrow they would fly to a forward operating base where real combat awaited. The test of her abilities would come not in a simulator or a training exercise, but in actual battle, where mistakes had permanent consequences. She knew that one error, one moment of hesitation, would be used as proof that women could not handle combat aviation. The pressure was immense, but Sarah had learned to channel pressure into focus. As she prepared her gear for the deployment, Sarah made a silent promise to herself and to her father's memory. She would prove that skill, dedication, and courage had no gender. She would show that an Apache pilot's worth was measured not by physical strength alone, but by intelligence, precision, and heart. The doubters would have their chance to see what she could do. She was ready to show them they had been wrong all along. The forward operating base sat like a scar on the desert landscape, surrounded by blast walls and watchtowers. Sarah's unit arrived during a sandstorm that turned the sky orange and reduced visibility to almost nothing. The harsh environment matched the hostile reception she faced. The ground commanders greeted the Apache pilots with relief, desperately needing air support for their embattled troops. But their enthusiasm dimmed when they learned one of the pilots was a woman. Captain Sarah Mitchell tried to ignore the sideways glances and hushed conversations. She focused on setting up her equipment and preparing for missions. The operations tent buzzed with activity as pilots reviewed intelligence reports and planned sorties. Sarah stood at the edge of these gatherings, absorbing information but rarely invited to contribute. When she offered tactical suggestions, they were met with polite nods and then promptly ignored. The message was clear. She could be present, but her opinions held no weight. The first week brought a series of routine missions. Sarah flew reconnaissance runs circling over friendly positions while her male counterparts took the combat assignments. She watched from a distance as they engaged enemy positions. Their gun camera footage reviewed each evening with great excitement. The other pilots would gather around screens, reliving their missions and celebrating successful strikes. Sarah sat apart, her own uneventful footage barely worth discussing. She felt like a spectator in her own military career. Colonel Bradford maintained his protective stance, assigning her only the safest missions. He justified it by saying he was following protocol, ensuring all pilots started with low-risk assignments. But Sarah noticed that the male pilots who arrived with her had already moved on to combat roles. She was being held back, wrapped in cotton wool while her skills atrophied from underuse. The frustration built inside her like steam in a sealed container. But she maintained her professional composure, knowing that any complaint would be seen as weakness. Lieutenant Marcus Chen was one of the few pilots who treated Sarah with genuine respect. A skilled aviator himself, he had seen her training scores and recognized her abilities. During mission briefings, he would sometimes turn to her for input, valuing her tactical analysis. The other pilots seemed puzzled by this, as if Chen was humoring a child rather than consulting a fellow professional. But Chen persisted, and gradually, A few others began to pay attention when Sarah spoke. The turning point came on a scorching afternoon when intelligence reported enemy forces massing for an attack on a forward patrol base. The base housed 50 soldiers who would be overrun without immediate air support. Every available Apache was needed, and suddenly, Sarah's gender became less important than the firepower she could bring. Colonel Bradford had no choice but to include her in the mission roster. His face betrayed his reluctance as he briefed her, emphasizing that she should stay in a support position and not take unnecessary risks. Sarah felt her heart race as she conducted her pre-flight inspection. This was the moment she had prepared for her entire career. Master Sergeant Rodriguez worked beside her, his experienced hands checking systems with practiced efficiency. He caught her eye and gave her a slight nod, a gesture of confidence that steadied her nerves. As she climbed into the cockpit, the weight of expectation settled on her shoulders. She knew that every decision she made today would be scrutinized, every action judged against impossible standards. The flight to the patrol base took 20 minutes. 4 Apaches flying in formation across the desert terrain. Sarah flew as number 3, positioned to provide supporting fire while the lead aircraft engaged primary targets. Through her helmet's display, she could see the tactical situation unfolding. Enemy forces had the patrol base surrounded on 3 sides, using the terrain to conceal their positions. The ground commander's voice crackled over the radio, urgent and desperate. They were taking heavy fire and needed the Apaches now. The lead aircraft dove toward the engagement, their chain guns roaring to life. Sarah watched the infrared display as enemy positions lit up under the attack. Her own weapons remained silent as she orbited the battlefield, waiting for her moment. Lieutenant Chen flew beside her, and she heard him call out additional targets on the radio. The coordination was complex, with multiple aircraft engaging threats while avoiding friendly positions. One wrong move could be catastrophic, then Sarah saw it. On the eastern ridge, partially hidden in a rocky outcrop, was a group of enemy fighters setting up heavy weapons. From their position, they had a clear shot at the patrol base and at the Apaches making their gun runs. Sarah's tactical analysis kicked in immediately. She recognized the danger before anyone else, seeing how the enemy had positioned themselves to ambush the helicopters as they broke from their attack runs. If she did not act, those weapons would tear into her fellow pilots. Her training took over. Sarah broke formation without waiting for authorization, banking her Apache hard toward the eastern ridge. Colonel Bradford's voice exploded in her headset, demanding to know what she was doing. She ignored him, focusing entirely on the target. The enemy fighters were still setting up their weapons when Sarah came screaming over the ridgeline. She fired with precision, her rockets impacting exactly where she had aimed. The threat disappeared in a cloud of dust and debris, but the situation was far from over. As Sarah pulled up from her attack run, her warning system screamed. Someone was targeting her with anti-aircraft fire. Tracers arced through the air around her helicopter, bright lines of death seeking her aircraft. Sarah threw the Apache into a series of evasive maneuvers, using every trick she had learned in training. She dove toward the ground using terrain to break the enemy's line of sight, then popped up in a different location to engage new targets. The radio erupted with voices. The other pilots had seen her attack and were now coordinating to support her. Lieutenant Chen called out enemy positions while the lead aircraft redirected their fire to cover Sarah's exposed position. The battle became a deadly dance, with the Apaches working together to suppress the enemy forces. Sarah's actions had not only eliminated a serious threat, but had also revealed the enemy's true positions, allowing the entire flight to adjust their tactics. For 15 intense minutes, Sarah flew and fought with absolute focus. She maneuvered her Apache through a storm of enemy fire, engaging targets while protecting her fellow pilots. Her weapon's accuracy was phenomenal, each burst of cannon fire hitting exactly where she intended. She used her helicopter systems to their full potential, switching between thermal and optical views to identify threats that others missed. The Apache became an extension of her will, responding to her commands with deadly precision. When the enemy forces finally broke and retreated, the patrol base was secure. Sarah's fuel gauge showed she had just enough to make it back to base. Her hands were steady on the controls, but her body was drenched in sweat from the physical demands of combat flying. As the Apaches formed up for the return flight, the radio came alive with chatter. The ground commander was thanking them, his voice thick with emotion. His soldiers had been saved by the timely intervention of the air support. Back at the forward operating base, Sarah climbed out of her Apache on shaking legs. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted and drained. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was there immediately, his eyes bright with pride. He had monitored the entire mission on the radio and knew exactly what she had accomplished. As other pilots gathered around to review what had happened, Sarah prepared herself for criticism. She had broken formation and disobeyed orders, actions that could result in disciplinary measures. Instead, she found something unexpected in the faces around her. Lieutenant Chen was grinning, slapping her shoulder in congratulation. Even the lead pilot, who had always been coolly distant, nodded in acknowledgement of her skill. They had seen her fly and fight under the most demanding conditions possible. They had witnessed her tactical awareness save lives and her flying ability keep her alive in a deadly environment. The footage from her gun camera would tell the story of a pilot who had performed brilliantly when it mattered most. Colonel Bradford arrived at the flight line, his expression unreadable. Sarah braced herself for the reprimand she was certain was coming, but the colonel surprised her. After a long moment of silence, he simply asked her to walk with him. Away from the others, he told her that while her breach of protocol was concerning, her actions had undeniably saved lives. He admitted, with obvious difficulty, that she had proven herself in combat. It was not a complete acceptance, but it was a crack in the wall of skepticism that had surrounded her. That evening, as Sarah lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, she replayed the mission in her mind. She had proven something today, not just to others, but to herself. She could fly and fight with the best of them. The Apache had responded to her commands perfectly, and she had made decisions under pressure that had kept everyone alive. But she also knew that one successful mission would not erase years of prejudice. She had won a battle, but the war for acceptance was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new doubts to overcome. Yet for the first time since arriving at the forward base, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She had shown them what she could do, and there was no denying the evidence. The dynamics in the operations tent shifted after Sarah's first combat mission. The change was subtle but unmistakable. When she entered for morning briefings, conversations no longer died away into awkward silence. Pilots nodded to her in greeting, and a few even moved to make space for her at the tactical maps. Colonel Bradford still watched her with cautious eyes, but he began assigning her to regular combat rotations alongside the other pilots. The protective bubble had been punctured, though not entirely deflated. Sarah threw herself into every mission with intense focus. She flew convoy escorts through dangerous territory, her Apache circling overhead like a protective guardian. She provided close air support for ground troops engaged in firefights, her weapons striking with surgical precision just meters from friendly forces. Each mission added to her combat experience, and each successful engagement built her reputation among the unit. The gun camera footage did not lie. Her accuracy scores remained consistently high, and her tactical decisions saved lives repeatedly. Master Sergeant Rodriguez became her strongest advocate. During maintenance briefings, he would point out Sarah's careful treatment of her aircraft, how she consistently caught minor issues before they became major problems. He told stories of pilots who were careless with their machines, comparing them unfavorably to Sarah's meticulous approach. The crew chiefs began to notice, and soon Sarah's Apache was always in top condition, maintained by teams who respected her professionalism. But not everyone was convinced. Captain Derek Morrison, a veteran pilot with 3 combat deployments, remained openly skeptical. He never criticized Sarah directly, but his comments carried clear implications. When she executed a particularly difficult maneuver, he would suggest it was luck rather than skill. When her weapon scores exceeded his own, he would mention that she probably had easier targets. His attitude influenced others, creating a faction within the unit that still viewed Sarah as an anomaly rather than an equal. The test of her abilities came during a mission that would push every pilot to their limits. Intelligence had located a high-value target, an enemy commander coordinating attacks across the region. The target was hiding in a compound deep in hostile territory, surrounded by anti-aircraft defenses and fighter positions. The mission required a night assault, flying low through mountain passes to avoid radar detection, then striking with overwhelming force before the enemy could react. It was the most dangerous type of operation an Apache could undertake, Colonel Bradford assembled his most experienced pilots for the mission briefing. Sarah listened as he outlined the plan, noting the numerous risks and challenges. The mountain passes were treacherous even in daylight, with turbulent winds and narrow passages that left little room for error. At night, with only thermal imaging and night vision systems to guide them, the difficulty multiplied exponentially. One mistake could send an Apache crashing into the mountainside. To Sarah's surprise, Colonel Bradford included her in the strike team. He explained that they needed 4 aircraft for the mission to succeed, and all 4 had to be flown by pilots capable of handling extreme conditions. His voice carried a note of reluctance but also resignation. He had seen enough of Sarah's flying to know she could handle it. Captain Morrison's face darkened at the announcement, his jaw clenching in obvious disapproval. After the briefing, he cornered the colonel, arguing that Sarah's inclusion was too risky for such a critical mission. Sarah overheard parts of their conversation. Morrison insisted that combat experience mattered more than training scores, that the mission was too important to use as a proving ground for female pilots. Colonel Bradford's response was firm but measured. He pointed out that Sarah had flown more combat missions in the past month than some pilots had flown in 6 months. Her performance had been consistently excellent, and her tactical awareness was among the best in the unit. If Morrison had concerns about any pilot's abilities, those concerns should be based on evidence, not prejudice. The exchange left Sarah feeling both validated and pressured. She had earned her place on the mission team through demonstrated skill, but she knew that any mistake she made would be magnified and used as proof that women did not belong in combat aviation. The stakes were impossibly high. She spent the afternoon studying maps and weather reports, memorizing every detail of the terrain they would cross. She reviewed footage from previous missions in the area, learning the patterns of enemy defenses and identifying potential threats. That evening, Lieutenant Chen found her in the hangar, studying her Apache systems for the 100th time. He sat down beside her, and for a moment they were silent. Then he told her something that shifted her perspective. He said that every combat pilot carried the same fear she was feeling, the worry that one mistake would cost lives. The pressure she felt was not unique to her situation, but was the burden of responsibility that came with the job. The difference was that she had to prove herself repeatedly, while others were given the benefit of doubt. It was unfair, he acknowledged, but she had already shown she could handle it. His words steadied her. Sarah realized she had been so focused on proving herself to others that she had lost sight of why she became a pilot. It was not about validation or acceptance. It was about serving her country and protecting those who depended on her. The mission ahead was dangerous, but she had trained for exactly this type of operation. Her skills were sharp, her aircraft was ready, and she knew what needed to be done. The rest was just noise. The mission launched at midnight under a moonless sky. 4 Apaches lifted off in sequence, their running lights extinguished, visible only as darker shadows against the night. Sarah flew in the number 2 position, tucked in tight behind the lead aircraft. The formation headed toward the mountains, flying low and fast across the desert floor. Through her night vision system, the world appeared in shades of green, the landscape rendered in ghostly detail. As they entered the mountain passes, the flying became intensely challenging. Turbulence buffeted the helicopters, and the narrow passages required constant corrections to avoid the rocky walls. Sarah's hands moved smoothly on the controls, making tiny adjustments to keep her Apache stable. She followed the lead aircraft through a series of turns, maintaining perfect formation spacing. Behind her, the other 2 pilots mirrored her movements, the 4 helicopters moving through the darkness like a single organism. The thermal imaging revealed scattered enemy positions along their route, but the Apaches remained undetected. The low altitude and terrain masking kept them below radar coverage, and their quiet approach gave no warning of their presence. Sarah's heart rate was elevated but controlled. She ran through the attack plan in her mind, visualizing each step of the engagement. In 15 minutes they would reach the target compound, and then the real test would begin. Suddenly, the lead aircraft's voice crackled over the radio with a warning. They had picked up unexpected anti-aircraft positions near the target, more defenses than intelligence had predicted. The enemy commander was clearly well protected, surrounded by weapons that could tear an Apache from the sky. The mission had just become significantly more dangerous. Colonel Bradford, flying as mission commander, had to make a decision. They could abort and try again another night, or they could proceed and deal with the additional threats. Sarah listened as he weighed the options. Intelligence suggested the target might relocate soon, and another opportunity might not come. The ground forces were counting on this strike to disrupt enemy operations, but proceeding meant exposing the Apaches to greater danger than planned. After a tense moment, Bradford made the call. They would continue, but with modified tactics. Instead of a direct assault, they would use a rolling attack with each aircraft engaging and then breaking away to let the next aircraft strike. It would be more complex and require perfect timing, but it would reduce their exposure to enemy fire. Sarah acknowledged the order along with the other pilots. The formation shifted, spreading out to prepare for the new approach. As they crested the final ridge before the target area, Sarah could see the compound through her thermal sights. It was a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by defensive positions. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned at each corner, their barrels sweeping the sky for threats. Ground forces moved between buildings, unaware of the death approaching from the darkness. The lead Apache initiated the attack, diving toward the compound with weapons blazing. Rockets streaked through the night, impacting with devastating accuracy. The enemy responded immediately, anti-aircraft fire lighting up TIR. Sarah pulled her Apache through a punishing turn as tracers streaked past her cockpit. The compound below had erupted into chaos, with explosions lighting up the night and enemy forces scrambling for cover. She leveled out and checked her systems. Everything was green. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. The third Apache was beginning its attack run, and she needed to reposition for another pass. The mission was going well, but it was far from over. Through her thermal display, Sarah watched the third aircraft, flown by Captain Morrison, begin his dive toward the target. His approach was aggressive, coming in fast and steep. She saw his weapons fire, rockets impacting near the main building where intelligence suggested the high-value target was hiding. But Morrison's angle was too steep, his speed too high. He was putting himself in the worst possible position, exposed to every anti-aircraft gun in the compound. The enemy fire intensified, converging on Morrison's Apache. Sarah saw it immediately, the convergence of multiple weapons tracking his aircraft. She keyed her radio to warn him, but Morrison was already committed to his attack. Then disaster struck. A burst of anti-aircraft fire found its mark, and Sarah saw the impact flashes along Morrison's tail section. His Apache shuddered, began to spin. The hydraulics were hit, the tail rotor damaged. Morrison fought for control, but the helicopter was mortally wounded. Colonel Bradford's voice cut through the radio chatter, ordering Morrison to abort and head for the emergency landing zone they had identified before the mission. But Morrison's Apache was losing altitude fast, auto-rotating toward the ground. He might not make it to the landing zone. Worse, he was going down in hostile territory, surrounded by enemy forces. If he survived the crash, he would be captured or killed within minutes. Sarah made her decision without conscious thought. While the other Apaches continued engaging the compound, she broke away and dove toward Morrison's descending helicopter. She could see him struggling with the controls, trying to guide his damaged aircraft toward clear ground. He was going to crash hard, but there was a small clearing about 200 meters from the compound that might work. Sarah positioned her Apache to provide covering fire. Her weapons systems locked on enemy positions between the clearing and the compound. Morrison's Apache hit the ground with a sickening crunch, the impact tearing off the landing gear and sending debris flying. But the cockpit remained mostly intact, and Sarah saw movement inside. Morrison and his co-pilot were alive, at least for the moment. Enemy forces were already moving toward the crash site, drawn by the pillar of dust and the chance to capture American pilots. Sarah had seconds to act. She brought her Apache down low, firing her chain gun at the advancing enemy forces. The 30mm rounds chewed up the ground, forcing the enemy to take cover. Her targeting system identified individual fighters, and she engaged them with brutal efficiency. But there were too many, and they were closing in from multiple directions. Morrison and his co-pilot had climbed out of the wreckage and were moving away from their destroyed helicopter. But they were on foot and heavily outnumbered. Colonel Bradford's voice came over the radio ordering Sarah to pull back. The mission was compromised, and losing another Apache would be catastrophic. But Sarah could see Morrison and his co-pilot stumbling through the darkness, injured and disoriented. If she left now, they would die. She thought of all the times Morrison had doubted her, questioned her abilities, argued against her inclusion in missions. None of that mattered now. He was a fellow pilot and she would not abandon him. Sarah made her choice. She told Bradford she was going in to extract them. The colonel's response was immediate and forceful. Negative, too dangerous. Ground extraction teams were being scrambled. She was to break off immediately. Sarah acknowledged the order, then ignored it. She brought her Apache into a hover just meters from where Morrison and his co-pilot were struggling through the rough terrain. The downwash from her rotors kicked up a storm of dust, but it also provided cover from enemy fire. Master Sergeant Rodriguez's voice came over the internal communication system. He was in the back of the Apache, operating the weapon systems. His voice was calm despite the chaos, asking Sarah what she needed from him. She told him to be ready to provide covering fire while she got as close as possible to the downed pilots. Rodriguez acknowledged without hesitation. Whatever doubts others might have about Sarah's decisions, he trusted her completely. The extraction was a nightmare of precision flying. Sarah had to hover at the absolute limit of her helicopter's capabilities, using every bit of skill to keep the aircraft stable in the turbulent air near the ground. Enemy fire was intensifying, rounds pinging off the Apache's armor. Her warning systems screamed at her, but she blocked them out. Morrison and his co-pilot reached the side of her helicopter. Rodriguez was directing them, telling them where to grab hold. The Apache had no passenger compartment, but there were external points where they could clip their safety harnesses. Morrison looked up at Sarah's cockpit, and even through the chaos she could see the shock on his face. The pilot he had dismissed, the woman he had argued should not be on combat missions, was risking everything to save him. His co-pilot was already securing himself to the helicopter's exterior. Morrison hesitated for just a moment, then followed suit. As soon as Rodriguez confirmed they were attached, Sarah began pulling up, lifting the Apache with its unexpected passengers clinging to the outside. The additional weight changed the helicopter's handling dramatically. Sarah fought to keep it stable as she accelerated away from the compound. Enemy fire followed them, but she was already maneuvering, using the terrain to shield them from the worst of it. Morrison and his co-pilot were exposed to the wind and the danger, but they were alive and moving away from the enemy. Sarah's arms burned from the effort of controlling the overloaded helicopter, but she pushed through the pain. Colonel Bradford was coordinating the other Apaches to provide cover for Sarah's withdrawal. Lieutenant Chen positioned his aircraft to draw enemy fire, while Sarah gained altitude and speed. The teamwork was seamless, pilots working together to ensure everyone made it out. Sarah's Apache climbed slowly, struggling with the extra weight but gradually putting distance between them and the hostile forces below. The mission to eliminate the high-value target had become a rescue operation, but the important thing was bringing everyone home. The flight back to base was tense. Sarah had to fly carefully, aware that any aggressive maneuver might dislodge Morrison or his co-pilot from their precarious perches. Her fuel was running low from the extended time over the target area, and the additional drag from the external passengers was not helping. She calculated the distance to base, ran the numbers on fuel consumption, and realized it would be extremely close. There was no margin for error, no fuel for a second approach if she misjudged the landing. As they crossed back into friendly territory, Sarah felt some of the tension ease. They were not safe yet, but at least they were out of immediate danger. She could hear Morrison on the radio, using his emergency locator beacon to communicate with the flight. His voice was strained, but he was thanking her, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. Sarah did not respond, focused entirely on getting them back safely. The gratitude could wait until they were on the ground. The forward operating base came into view, its lights a welcome sight in the darkness. Sarah lined up for her approach, keenly aware that landing with Morrison and his co-pilot on the exterior would require absolute precision. Too fast and they could be injured by the impact. Too slow and she risked losing control of the overloaded aircraft. She called for emergency vehicles to be ready, knowing that both men might need medical attention immediately upon landing. The touchdown was gentle, one of Sarah's best landings ever. As soon as the Apache settled onto the tarmac, ground crews rushed forward to help Morrison and his co-pilot dismount from the helicopter's exterior. Both men were battered and exhausted, but remarkably intact given what they had been through. Medical personnel examined them while Sarah went through her shutdown procedures. her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. When Sarah finally climbed out of her cockpit, she found Colonel Bradford waiting for her. His face was a mixture of emotions, anger at her disobedience warring with relief that everyone had survived. Before he could speak, Morrison approached, limping slightly from his injuries. He stood before Sarah, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then Morrison did something that shocked everyone watching. He saluted her, a gesture of respect and recognition that carried enormous significance. The words Morrison spoke were simple, but profound. He admitted he had been wrong about her. He said that what she had done tonight took courage and skill beyond measure, that she had saved his life when she could have followed orders and left him behind. He acknowledged that gender had nothing to do with being a combat pilot. What mattered was heart, skill, and the willingness to put everything on the line for your fellow warriors. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, the weight of his near-death experience and his previous prejudice combining to break through his emotional barriers. Other pilots had gathered to witness the moment. They had heard the radio chatter, knew what Sarah had done. The promotion ceremony took place on a dusty parade ground at the forward operating base. Sarah stood at attention as Colonel Bradford pinned the new rank insignia on her uniform, officially making her a flight lead. Behind her, the unit's Apache helicopters were lined up in perfect formation, their presence a reminder of the machines and missions that defined their purpose. The gathered personnel represented a cross-section of the aviation community, from seasoned veterans to fresh arrivals, all witnessing a moment that carried significance beyond the individual achievement. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah felt the weight of new responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was now responsible not just for her own performance, but for the lives and development of the pilots under her command. The role carried expectations that went beyond flying skill. She would need to mentor, to teach, to make difficult decisions that could mean the difference between success and disaster. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her first mission as flight lead came sooner than expected. Intelligence had identified a convoy of enemy vehicles moving supplies to forward positions. The convoy was heavily defended, with anti-aircraft weapons integrated into the formation. The mission required precise coordination, with multiple Apaches working together to overwhelm the defenses and destroy the targets. Sarah would be responsible for planning the attack and leading the execution. She gathered her flight team in the operations tent. Lieutenant Chen would fly as her wingman, a position of trust that reflected their mutual respect. Two other pilots, both experienced but younger than Sarah, would complete the 4-aircraft formation. As she briefed the mission, Sarah was acutely aware of the scrutiny. Some were watching to see if she truly deserved her position, while others were genuinely interested in learning from her tactical approach. She pushed aside the self-consciousness and focused on the task. Sarah's planning was meticulous. She identified multiple approach routes, analyzing the advantages and risks of each option. She assigned specific targets to each aircraft, ensuring that their weapons would be used most effectively. She established communication protocols and contingency plans for various scenarios. The briefing was thorough without being overwhelming, detailed without losing sight of the main objectives. When she finished, the other pilots nodded their understanding, their questions indicating they had absorbed the information and were ready to execute. The mission launched in the afternoon, 4 Apaches lifting off into a clear sky. Sarah led the formation toward the target area, her senses alert for any sign of trouble. The intelligence estimates had been accurate, and they spotted the convoy moving along a desert road exactly where predicted. Sarah ordered the flight into attack formation, each aircraft moving to their designated position. The coordination was smooth, the result of careful planning and skilled pilots working together. The engagement began with Sarah's aircraft firing the first salvo. Her rockets struck the lead vehicle in the convoy, destroying it and blocking the road ahead. The other Apaches followed in rapid succession, their weapons overwhelming the convoy's defenses. The enemy's anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and ineffective, unable to track the fast-moving helicopters attacking from multiple directions. Within minutes, the entire convoy was destroyed. Burning wrecks scattered along the road. But as Sarah was calling for the flight to regroup and return to base, her radar warning system alerted her to a new threat. Enemy aircraft were approaching, fast movers that could pose a serious danger to the slower helicopters. Sarah's mind raced through her options. They could try to outrun the enemy, using terrain to mask their escape. They could engage, though Apaches were not designed for air-to-air combat. Or they could call for support from friendly fighters, though response time might be too slow. She made her decision quickly, ordering the flight to go low and fast, using a nearby canyon system for cover. The terrain would limit the enemy aircraft's maneuverability advantage, leveling the playing field somewhat. As they dove toward the canyon, Sarah kept one eye on her radar, tracking the pursuing aircraft. The enemy was closing fast, and she knew they would have to fight if the pursuers followed them into the canyon. The canyon walls rose around them as the Apaches raced through the narrow passage. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls, guiding her helicopter through the twisting route with precision. Behind her, the other pilots maintained formation, trusting her leadership. The radar showed the enemy aircraft reaching the canyon entrance, and to Sarah's concern, they were following the helicopters into the confined space. The hunters had become engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Sarah spotted a side canyon ahead, a narrow branch that offered a potential escape route. She made a split-second decision, ordering Lieutenant Chen to take one aircraft and continue through the main canyon, while she and the fourth aircraft took the side passage. The maneuver would split the enemy's attention, forcing them to choose which target to pursue. It was a risky gambit, but staying together made them an easier target for the faster enemy aircraft. The plan worked. The enemy aircraft split their formation, one following Chen while the other pursued Sarah. She pushed her Apache to its limits, the helicopter screaming through the narrow side canyon at dangerous speed. The walls flashed past just meters from her rotor blades, leaving no room for error. Behind her, she could hear her wingman breathing hard over the radio, the stress of the flight evident in his voice. But he stayed with her, matching her every move. The enemy aircraft was gaining, and Sarah knew she would have to do something unexpected to survive. She spotted a sharp turn ahead where the canyon branched again. Instead of turning, she brought her Apache to a sudden hover, using the canyon wall to mask her position. The enemy aircraft shot past, unable to stop or turn quickly enough in the confined space. For a brief moment, Sarah had the advantage. She brought her nose around, locked onto the enemy aircraft with her targeting system, and fired. The Apache's weapons were not ideal for air-to-air combat, but at close range in a confined space they were devastating. Her burst caught the enemy aircraft as it tried to maneuver for another pass. The hits were not catastrophic, but they damaged the aircraft enough to force it to break off the engagement and flee. Sarah did not pursue, instead calling for her wingman to reform and heading for the rendezvous point where the flight would regroup. Lieutenant Chen and his wingman were waiting at the rendezvous, both aircraft intact and crews unhurt. They too had managed to evade their pursuer, using similar tactics of terrain masking and sudden maneuvers. As the four Apaches formed up and headed home, Sarah felt a surge of pride in her team. They had completed the primary mission, destroyed the enemy convoy, and survived an unexpected aerial engagement. The success was a testament to good planning, skilled flying, and teamwork. Back at base, the mission debrief became an impromptu teaching session. Other pilots gathered to hear about the aerial engagement, eager to learn from Sarah's experience. She walked them through her decision-making process, explaining why she had chosen to split the flight, and how she had used the terrain to overcome the enemy's speed advantage. The discussion was animated, with pilots offering their own observations and suggestions. Sarah encouraged the dialogue, knowing that shared knowledge made everyone better. Master Sergeant Rodriguez pulled her aside after the debrief. His weathered face showed concern mixed with pride. He told her that word of her aerial engagement was spreading quickly, adding to her growing reputation. But he cautioned her about the burden of expectations that came with success. People would look to her as a symbol, expecting her to be perfect in every situation. The pressure could be crushing if she let it become more important than the work itself. His advice was to stay focused on the mission and the people she served with, to remember why she became a pilot in the first place. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected communication. It was a message from a young woman attending the Air Force Academy, someone she had never met. The woman wrote that Sarah's story had inspired her to pursue combat aviation, a dream she had been told was unrealistic for someone of her gender. She thanked Sarah for proving that women could excel in the most demanding roles, for opening doors that had been closed for so long. The message moved Sarah deeply, reminding her that her struggles and successes had meaning beyond her personal ambitions. Sarah spent time crafting her response, wanting to provide encouragement without sugarcoating the challenges ahead. She wrote about the obstacles she had faced, the doubters she had encountered, the moments of doubt she had experienced herself. But she also wrote about the satisfaction of overcoming those challenges, the pride of earning respect through demonstrated competence, the joy of flying and serving. She emphasized that gender was just one aspect of who they were, that their worth would ultimately be determined by their skills, dedication, and character. As she sent the message, Sarah reflected on how far she had come. She had entered military aviation as an outsider, fighting for every opportunity. Now she was a flight lead, responsible for training the next generation of pilots. The journey had been difficult, Mark. The Advanced Tactics Training Center was located at a base known for producing the military's elite aviators. Sarah arrived on a gray morning, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder and a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty churning in her stomach. The facility was impressive, with state-of-the-art simulators and aircraft representing the cutting edge of military aviation technology. Pilots from various units wandered the grounds, each one selected for their exceptional abilities. Sarah was entering a community of the best, where her previous accomplishments would be just the baseline for entry. The initial briefing made clear the program's intensity. They would be developing new tactics for Apache operations, testing theories in simulators and live exercises, pushing the boundaries of what the helicopter could achieve. The instructors were legends in the aviation community, pilots whose names were spoken with reverence. They evaluated Sarah with the same critical eye they applied to everyone, searching for any weakness that might compromise the program's mission. She met their scrutiny without flinching, knowing her record would speak for itself. The other students in the program represented a cross-section of military aviation excellence. There were pilots with decades of experience and younger aviators who had risen rapidly through exceptional performance. Sarah was the only woman in the program, a fact that did not surprise her but did create a familiar sense of isolation. The initial interactions were polite but distant, the other pilots reserving judgment until they could evaluate her abilities directly. The first week consisted of intensive simulator training. They flew scenarios that pushed helicopters and pilots to absolute limits, testing new tactical approaches in controlled environments. Sarah approached each session with focused intensity, applying everything she had learned from combat experience and previous training. Her performance was solid, demonstrating both technical skill and tactical awareness. But she knew that simulator results, however impressive, would not be enough to earn genuine respect in this environment. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging exercise. The scenario involved a deep penetration mission into heavily defended territory, requiring precise navigation, perfect timing, and seamless coordination between multiple aircraft. Several students had attempted the scenario and failed, their approaches too aggressive or too cautious. When Sarah's turn came, she took a moment to analyze the problem from a different angle, looking for solutions others might have missed. Her approach was unconventional. Instead of following the expected attack patterns, she used terrain and timing to create a deceptive approach that confused the simulated enemy defenses. She exploited weaknesses in the defensive coverage that others had overlooked, finding windows of opportunity that allowed her to strike with devastating effectiveness. The execution required split-second timing and absolute precision, but Sarah flew with confidence born from combat experience. When the scenario ended, her success was undeniable. The lead instructor, a colonel named James Peterson, gathered the students to review Sarah's performance. He walked through her approach step by step, highlighting the innovative thinking that had made it successful. He pointed out that true tactical excellence came not from following established patterns, but from understanding principles deeply enough to apply them creatively. Sarah's approach had demonstrated exactly that kind of understanding. The respect in his voice was evident, and the other students took notice. After that session, the dynamic shifted. The other pilots began seeking Sarah out for discussions about tactics and techniques. They asked about her combat experiences, genuinely interested in learning from her perspective. Small groups formed around her during breaks, conversations flowing naturally as they debated approaches and shared insights. Sarah found herself contributing to the collective knowledge of the group, her unique experiences adding valuable dimensions to their understanding. One pilot in particular, Captain David Torres, became a close colleague. He was a highly skilled aviator with a thoughtful approach to aviation that matched Sarah's analytical style. They spent hours discussing tactics, challenging each other's assumptions, and refining their ideas. Torres had no preconceptions about women in combat roles, judging Sarah solely on her abilities and contributions. Their partnership produced some of the program's most innovative tactical concepts, approaches that would later be incorporated into official doctrine. The live-fire exercises provided the ultimate test of their developing tactics. Flying actual Apaches in realistic combat scenarios, the students had opportunities to prove their concepts worked in the real world. Sarah led several missions, applying the tactics she and her colleagues had developed in the simulators. The results were impressive, with mission success rates exceeding expectations and engagement outcomes consistently favorable. Her leadership style, collaborative yet decisive, earned admiration from students and instructors alike. Colonel Peterson began assigning Sarah additional responsibilities. Recognizing her potential as both a tactician and a leader, she helped design training scenarios, incorporating lessons from her combat experience to make the exercises more realistic. She mentored junior pilots, sharing not just technical knowledge but also the psychological aspects of combat flying. Her impact on the program extended beyond her own performance to influence how others learned and developed. But the assignment also brought unexpected challenges. Media attention found her at the training center, journalists wanting to tell the story of the pioneering female Apache pilot. Sarah had always been uncomfortable with publicity, preferring to let her work speak for itself. The attention felt like a distraction from the real mission, pulling focus away from the collective effort of the program. She declined most interview requests, wanting to be seen as a pilot first rather than a symbol or a novelty. The pressure of representation weighed on her in ways that male pilots never experienced. Every mistake she made seemed magnified, potentially reinforcing stereotypes about women in combat. Every success carried the burden of proving that her previous achievements were not flukes. Sarah found herself working longer hours, studying more intensely, flying with extra caution to avoid any error that might be used against her or against other women seeking similar opportunities. The constant vigilance was exhausting. One evening, Colonel Peterson called her to his office for a private conversation. He had observed the pressure she was under, recognized the additional burden she carried. He told her something that shifted her perspective fundamentally. He said that great pilots, regardless of gender, all face the same internal challenges: the fear of failure, the pressure to perform, the weight of responsibility for others' lives. What distinguished the truly exceptional was not the absence of these pressures, but the ability to channel them into motivation rather than letting them become paralyzing. Peterson shared his own experiences, times when he had doubted himself or felt overwhelmed by expectations. He spoke about learning to focus on the controllable aspects of performance, accepting that perfection was impossible, but excellence was achievable. He encouraged Sarah to trust in her training and experience, to fly with confidence rather than caution. The conversation reminded her of Master Sergeant Rodriguez's advice, both men recognizing that her greatest challenges were often internal rather than external. As the program progressed toward its conclusion, Sarah's contributions were recognized formally. She was selected to present the final tactical briefing to senior military leadership, explaining the new doctrines and techniques the program had developed. The presentation was a significant responsibility, representing not just her own work, but the collective achievements of the entire class. She prepared meticulously, knowing that this opportunity could influence the future of Apache operations across the military. The presentation day arrived with high-ranking officers from multiple branches filling the briefing room. Sarah stood before them, composed and confident, and walked through the tactical innovations they had developed. She explained the theoretical foundations, demonstrated the practical applications, and presented the results from their testing and exercises. The briefing was clear, thorough, and compelling. Questions from the audience were probing, but Sarah answered them with expertise that reflected both deep knowledge and practical experience. When the briefing concluded, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Senior officers approached Sarah individually, expressing appreciation for her work and asking detailed questions about implementation. Several mentioned that they would be recommending the new tactics for immediate adoption across Apache units. Colonel Peterson stood to the side, a subtle smile on his face, clearly pleased with how his student had represented the program. The graduation ceremony for the Advanced Tactics program carried special significance. Sarah stood among the elite group of pilots who had completed the intensive training, knowing that she had earned her place through demonstrated excellence. The certificate she received represented not just completion of a course, but validation of her approach to combat aviation, confirmation that her ideas and abilities had value at the highest levels of military aviation.